Dead America. Tales of the First Month. The Thunderstorm. By Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Day 0+26. Just beyond the outskirts of the quaint rural community of Providence, North Carolina, sprawled the expansive Watson Farm. Over the span of 6 decades, it had blossomed from modest origins as a family homestead barely eking out a living to a thriving local hub for fresh produce. In recent weeks, however, it had assumed a new role as a sanctuary for the scant survivors of Providence. The scourge of the zombie virus had descended upon the town with merciless ferocity, catching its denizens wholly unprepared. Even amidst the devastating toll the virus exacted on his own kin, Mr. Watson had gallantly shouldered the responsibility of transforming his farm into a bastion of safety for the afflicted townsfolk. In the tumultuous early days of the outbreak, he had braved perilous odds to pluck people from the clutches of danger, offering them solace and shelter within the farm's confines. Navigating the treacherous path to safety had proven arduous, yet maintaining that safety proved an even more formidable challenge. Situated 30 miles north of Raleigh, the bustling state capital, Watson Farm lay perilously close to the highway that served as a direct conduit into the heart of the city. This proximity ensured that wandering packs of undead frequently shambled up their way, necessitating the use of diversionary tactics, and today was no exception. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, Mr. Watson found himself perched beside an oil drum stationed half a mile from the highway. His weathered gaze swept across the landscape, punctuated by clusters of trees that stood sentinel-like against the encroaching threat. Nearby, his 22-year-old daughter, Sophia, toiled away at the drum. "How are we looking, kiddo?" Mr. Watson inquired. Sophia paused briefly, wiping sweat from her brow before responding. "This should work, but I'm not 100% sure. Max and Robert said that there's a few hundred of those things bearing down on us, so you better get to 100% real quick," her father responded. Sophia released a weary sigh, her gaze shifting upward to meet the weathered face of her father, a man marked by years of hard work and perseverance. "If you want me to be 100% sure," she began, her voice tinged with frustration, "then we're going to have to start venturing out further away from the farm for supplies. We've burned through everything I'm confident in over the last couple of weeks, so I'm having to get creative with how to make things go boom." Mr. Watson looked at his daughter, offering her a soft smile and a nod. He knew that she was right, but with the lack of able-bodied people at the farm and the losses they had suffered with the last excursion, he was hesitant to go down that road again. "How confident are you?" he inquired. "I know it's going to do something," Sophia replied. "I just don't know if it's going to be loud enough to pull them off the road." "Let's hope so," Mr. Watson murmured, his gaze shifting to the horizon, "because we're a mile away from the farm, and it's getting a little late in the day for visitors." Sophia's smirk persisted as she resumed her task of preparing the diversion, her hands moving deftly as she worked. In the midst of her focus, the crackle of the walkie-talkie broke through the air. "Mr. Watson, do you copy?" Robert's voice came through the device. "Yeah, I read you, Robert," Mr. Watson responded promptly. "How are we looking down there?" "There's a whole mess of these things," Robert reported, "and they seem hell-bent on heading our way." "How close are they?" Mr. Watson asked. "About a quarter mile from your position," Robert replied. "Okay, I want you and Max to get off the road and head back to the farm on the trail," Mr. Watson instructed firmly. "We won't be far behind." "Copy that," Robert acknowledged before signing off. Mr. Watson turned to Sophia, who swiftly sealed the lid of the oil drum before unfurling a fuse, her movements purposeful. "I think it's time to light that puppy up," Mr. Watson declared. Sophia nodded in confirmation, her fingers steady as she produced a lighter. With a swift motion, she brought the flame to the fuse, igniting it and sending sparks dancing into the air. Without hesitation, father and daughter set off through the dense woods, their strides purposeful as they veered away from the road toward the parallel trail. Upon reaching it, they turned their gaze away from the farm and caught sight of Robert and Max approaching. The two men, both in their early 30s and exuding a sense of readiness, joined the pair. "Are we good to go?" Max inquired. "The fuse is lit and should be going off in 5 minutes," Sophia confirmed. Good, that's about how long it's going to take for the mob to get up there, Robert remarked grimly. As the group began to trek back toward the farm, situated on the opposite side of the road from the trail and diversion, they remained vigilant, acutely aware of the recent incursion by the creatures and the potential threats lurking in the shadows. "Come on, we need to get a move on," Mr. Watson urged, his voice commanding. "I want to be at the crossing before this thing blows." With determination fueling their steps, they pressed onward. All four of them quickened their pace, transitioning into a light jog along the trail. Though the daylight was fading, they still had enough visibility to navigate their path. Amidst their movement, Sophia remained vigilant, her eyes fixed on her watch as she counted down the seconds. 4 minutes later, they had covered a considerable distance along the trail, their pace gradually slowing as they approached a junction leading back toward the road. "How much time?" Mr. Watson inquired. 60 seconds, give or take," Sophia responded. "Let's get across the street," Mr. Watson declared. "I don't want to risk some of them spotting us and heading to the farm." With unanimous agreement, they hastened their steps, reaching the road and casting their gaze toward the approaching mob. Sophia couldn't help but gasp at the sight before them, a horde of hundreds of ghouls, moving in a grotesque pack, inching closer with every shambling step. Despite the distance of half a mile, the putrid stench emanating from the mass of undead assailants still assaulted her senses. "That's just sad. So many lives. Just gone," Sophia remarked, her voice heavy with sorrow. "If we don't get off the road before they spot us, then we're going to be among them," Max cautioned. Sophia nodded in agreement as the four of them swiftly retreated from the road. Mr. Watson paused at the edge of the trees, ensuring they remained concealed as he observed the approaching horde. Meanwhile, Sophia glanced at her watch, her anticipation building as she counted down from 5. At the exact moment she reached 0, a deafening boom echoed from across the street. "That's some solid work, Sophia," Robert commended. "Thanks," Sophia replied modestly. "Sounded a lot better than I thought it would, if I'm being honest." Mr. Watson remained rooted in place, his eyes fixed on the horde of ghouls as they diverted from the road, drawn toward the explosion. A sense of pride swelled within him as he watched his daughter's handiwork unfold. However, before he could express his praise, the group was jolted by another thunderous boom emanating from behind them. "What the hell was that?" Max exclaimed. Mr. Watson's eyes widened in realization, and without a moment's hesitation, he bolted through the trees, his companions following closely behind. "Mr. Watson, what was that?" Max called out. As they reached a clearing 50 yards ahead, another explosion rocked the air, accompanied by a deep rumbling that sent shivers down their spines. "Oh my God," Sophia breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. The four of them turned their gaze back toward the farm, its silhouette barely visible in the distance, just half a mile away across the open field, and a couple of barbed wire fences. On the opposite side of the farmhouse, dark storm clouds loomed ominously, engulfing the sky in a shroud of darkness. They stood transfixed, watching as another deafening clap of thunder reverberated through the air, followed by a dazzling display of lightning illuminating the encroaching gloom. "Max, get back to the road and tell me what you see." "Go now," Mr. Watson yelled. Without hesitation, Max reacted, pivoting on his heel and sprinting through the trees toward the road. Despite the branches whipping against him, he maintained his momentum. As he raced onward, the thunder roared louder behind him, signaling the approaching storm. Max skidded to a halt at the edge of the trees, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Son of a bitch," he muttered under his breath. Max's heart raced as he peered down at the horde of zombies, his stomach sinking as he watched them deviate from their expected path, heading toward the farm instead of the diversion. With a sense of impending dread gnawing at him, he turned on his heels and sprinted back to the group, the distant thunder serving as an ominous backdrop to his frantic retreat. Finally reuniting with the others, Max struggled to catch his breath, his words failing him as he conveyed the sheer terror reflected in his wide eyes. "Everybody get back to the farm, now," Mr. Watson commanded. Without hesitation, the group obeyed, hastening down the trail and across the open field toward the farmhouse. As they ducked beneath the first barbed wire fence, the first drops of rain began to fall, gradually intensifying into a torrential downpour by the time they reached the other side. "Robert, get in the barn and keep an eye on those things," Mr. Watson instructed, his gaze fixed on the gathering storm clouds hovering ominously above the house. "I don't think this storm is going anywhere, at least not before they get here," he added gravely. "Yes, sir," Mr. Watson, Robert said. Max tossed the walkie-talkie to Robert before the latter dashed off toward the barn, positioned about 50 yards away from the main house. Meanwhile, the other three hurried toward the main house, where several people stood out on the porch. The group on the porch, comprised of older individuals and younger children, initially seemed relaxed, enjoying the spectacle of the storm. However, their demeanor quickly shifted to concern as they caught sight of the trio approaching, sensing the gravity of the situation from the expressions on their faces. "Dad, what are we going to do?" Sophia's voice trembled with apprehension. "We talk inside," Mr. Watson replied solemnly, leading them into the house, where another dozen residents awaited them. Among them were individuals who were either too old, too young, or too injured to participate in any form of combat. Mr. Watson surveyed them briefly, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. "Dad, the tractor with the sled," Sophia interjected. Mr. Watson paused, considering her suggestion before nodding in acknowledgement. "You're right," he conceded. Stepping over to a small desk in the corner of the front room, Mr. Watson opened a drawer and rummaged through it. Moments later, he retrieved a set of keys, tossing them to Sophia. "Get them out of here," he instructed. Sophia shook her head vehemently, her expression one of staunch defiance. "No," she insisted, her voice unwavering. "Girl, this is no time to argue with your father," Mr. Watson admonished. "You need my help, and you're going to get it," Sophia countered, her determination clear as she stood her ground, locking eyes with her father. Recognizing the look in his daughter's gaze, Mr. Watson relented, taking the keys back before scanning the room for assistance. His eyes settled on Melvin, an older black farmer around his age, whom he beckoned over. "Hey, Melvin, got a job for you," Mr. Watson called out, gesturing for the man to approach. Melvin obliged, albeit with a slight limp, a souvenir from a past injury from a fall several years ago. "What can I do, Watson?" Melvin inquired. Mr. Watson handed him the set of tractor keys, causing a flicker of confusion to cross Melvin's features. "We have trouble, and it's going to be here soon. I need you to take the tractor out back, the one with the sled, and get these people out of here," Mr. Watson instructed. Melvin's eyes widened, knowing Mr. Watson wouldn't ask unless the situation was dire. "But where do I take them?" he inquired. Mr. Watson pondered for a moment, seeking guidance, and turned to Sophia, silently asking for her input. Without hesitation, Sophia stepped in with a suggestion. "Get them to your farm across the highway," she advised. "That's getting awfully close to the town, Sophia," Melvin remarked. "Trust me, it's safer than this place. At least for the next few hours. Just pull into your barn and keep the doors shut," Sophia reassured him. Melvin nodded in understanding, acknowledging the wisdom in Sophia's words, before turning to mobilize the others. "Okay, everybody, I need y'all to come on. We're going for a ride and we have to go right now. Get your raincoats too," he urged, his voice carrying a sense of urgency. As Melvin sprang into action, Sophia, Max, and Mr. Watson retreated into a small dining room, shutting the doors behind them. "So now what do we do?" Sophia whispered. Chapter 2. Mr. Watson, Robert, Max, and Sophia stood on the front porch, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the storm. They watched in silence as Melvin drove the tractor, dragging a large sled filled with the people they had rescued over the past few weeks, disappearing into the darkness as they moved away from the approaching horde. As the rain intensified, Mr. Watson turned and walked back into the house, the others following closely behind. While the younger trio wore expressions of apprehension, Mr. Watson remained stoic. "Do we have a plan?" Max's voice broke the silence. "Maybe if we lock this place down, they'll just walk on by and leave us alone," Robert suggested. Or maybe it starts hailing, and the noise on the metal roof draws them all over to the house, and we end up trapped, Sophia countered. Robert pondered for a moment before nodding in agreement. Before they could delve further into their discussion, Mr. Watson's voice boomed from the dining room, calling them all inside. Entering the room, the trio found the dining table cleared except for a sheet of poster board. Mr. Watson grabbed a marker, removing the cap with his teeth and spitting it to the corner of the room. They watched intently as he began sketching a rough outline of the farm, with the house at its center. He marked the large field they had crossed and the barn situated about 50 yards away from the house. "Everybody listen up and listen good." Mr. Watson's voice was firm, commanding attention. "We have one shot at this, and if we don't do it right, we're not going to see the sun come up tomorrow. Plus, those people we just sent away aren't going to have anyone to protect them." All three of them nodded in agreement, fully attentive to Mr. Watson's instructions. "Our ammunition isn't great," he continued, his tone serious. 12 shotgun shells and 15 rifle rounds. "So we're not shooting our way out of this. We're going to be getting up close and personal with these things." Robert, Max, and Sophia exchanged looks of concern, but they quickly shook them off, steeling themselves for the daunting task ahead. "Sophia, how many of those oil drums do you have prepped?" Mr. Watson inquired. "I have 2 in the barn that are nearly ready to go. I just need a few minutes with each of them to put the finishing touches on them," Sophia replied, her expression focused. "Good. I want you to get one prepped with a 2-minute fuse. The other with a 10-minute fuse," Mr. Watson instructed. Sophia furrowed her brow in confusion. "Where are we going to divert them to?" she questioned. "We're not diverting them anywhere. We're going to blow those suckers up," Mr. Watson clarified. "I don't know how well it's going to work. It's mostly just flammable liquids, and with as hard as it's raining, they're not going to stay lit all that long," Sophia said. "That's why on the 2-minute one, I want you to empty the hardware bench into it. Screws, bolts, nails, anything that can be used as a projectile, I want you to do it," Mr. Watson instructed. Sophia nodded in understanding. "What about the 10-minute one?" she inquired. "Just make it the biggest fireball you can and put it in the center of the barn," Mr. Watson replied. "You want to burn down the barn?" Sophia's voice held a note of disbelief. "I don't see any other way," Mr. Watson stated bluntly. Sophia nodded in agreement with Mr. Watson's plan. "What are we going to do, sir?" Robert's voice quivered with apprehension, his eyes darting between the others. "The 3 of us are going to get whatever weapons we can, and we're going to hold them off as long as we possibly can to buy Sophia the time she needs," Mr. Watson declared. Max and Robert exchanged worried glances, fear etching lines of tension on their faces. Sensing their trepidation, Mr. Watson slammed his hand down on the table, the sudden motion startling everyone but effectively capturing their full attention. "I know you're scared, but this is what needs to be done," he asserted. "We are going to fight them with everything we have, and we will hold that line. Is that understood?" Both Max and Robert nodded in agreement, their voices echoing a fervent "Yes, sir." "Good, that's what I like to hear," Mr. Watson acknowledged. "Max, grab that walkie-talkie and get down the path. I want updates every 2 minutes on how close they're getting to the outer fence." Max nodded before slapping Robert on the arm. "Pick me out something good from the barn. I want something with some reach," Max instructed. "I got you covered," Robert replied confidently. Max grabbed the walkie-talkie and dashed out the door, snagging a poncho on his way. "How are we getting them to the barn?" Sophia questioned. Mr. Watson strode purposefully to the corner of the room where the shotgun and hunting rifle leaned against the wall. He reached for the shotgun, his fingers wrapping around its familiar grip, and then opened a drawer, extracting a half-empty box of shotgun shells. He shook the box, the rattling sound echoing through the room, eliciting a sigh of resignation from him. "When they breach the second fence, I'm going to open fire with this from the barn entrance to draw them in. Hopefully, we'll have been able to thin their ranks enough for them all to fit inside," Mr. Watson explained. "And hopefully that gun is loud enough to get their attention over the thunderstorm," Robert added, his words punctuated by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the house. "One can only hope. Come on, We need to get our weapons, Mr. Watson said. The trio hurried out of the house, their footsteps quick and purposeful as they crossed the open area leading to the barn. The structure loomed tall and sturdy, a testament to its age and endurance, having stood for the better part of a century. Despite its age, it stood resolute, showing little signs of wear or decay. Upon reaching the barn, they flung open the two large doors, revealing the interior filled mostly with hay lining the walls and scattered across the upper platforms. In the center of the barn sat the oil drums, their lids removed, surrounded by a collection of smaller containers. "Sophia, get to work on those," Mr. Watson instructed. "Once you get the first one done, do you think you'll be able to get it to the field?" "Robert, help me get it onto the back of the four-wheeler trailer," Sophia directed. "That way, once I get it ready to go, I can just drive it out there." Robert glanced over at Mr. Watson, receiving a nod of approval from the elder man. With silent understanding, the two of them moved to maneuver the heavy barrel onto the trailer, their movements synchronized and efficient. Meanwhile, Mr. Watson walked over to the wall where a collection of tools lay, his gaze intent as he surveyed the array before him. Each tool held the potential to be wielded as a weapon in their fight against the approaching horde, and Mr. Watson deliberated carefully before making his selection. After a moment of contemplation, he reached out and grabbed a couple of weathered axes, their handles worn from years of use on the farm. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed them to the ground behind him, the heads of the axes clattering together loudly as they landed, drawing the attention of Robert and Sophia. Mr. Watson then reached up, selecting a large branch cutter from the bottom of the collection. He examined it closely, noting its 6-foot reach and the sharp, 12-inch scissor-like blades at the end. Testing its functionality by opening and closing it a few times, he nodded in satisfaction before adding it to the pile of weapons. He continued to stand there, contemplating his choices. Finally, he reached up to the top shelf, retrieving an antique sling blade. The massive tool boasted a 6-foot handle and a 3-foot curved blade. Giving it a few practice swings, Mr. Watson nodded to himself before adding it to the growing pile of weapons. "Dad, I don't think you're going to be lopping off too many heads with that thing," Sophia remarked. "I don't need to, daughter," Mr. Watson replied calmly. "We don't have to kill all of these things in one go. We just have to make sure they're disabled enough that we don't get overrun." Watson knelt down, pressing his thumb against the blade of the sling blade and giving it a slight touch. He looked down at his hand, noticing blood seeping from a fine cut caused by the incredibly sharp blade. "The more we put on the ground, the more obstacles the others have to walk over," he remarked. After a moment of consideration, he turned his attention back to the wall of tools. Spotting a stake driver, a pole with a long expanding spike on the end, his face lit up with a smile. Practicing a few downward stabs with it, he nodded in approval. "We get them on the ground, then do some cleanup after the storm," he concluded. Observing Robert and Sophia struggling with the oil drum, Watson moved to lend a hand. After some concerted effort, the three of them managed to hoist it onto the trailer attached to the four-wheeler. As Robert and Sophia began securing the drum, the walkie-talkie crackled to life. "Mr. Watson, do you copy?" Max's voice sounded from the device. "I'm here, Max. What do you see?" Watson responded. "The horde is still marching this way. They're a couple of 100 yards away from the first fence, and they're not slowing down," Max reported. A large crack of thunder echoed from outside the barn, rattling the structure. "I'm guessing you heard that?" Max asked. "We could feel it. I don't think this storm is going to be doing us any favors," Watson replied grimly. "I couldn't swear to it, but it looked like most of those things looked directly towards the house with that crack," Max added. "They probably did. Now get back to the fence. We're coming your way with the weapons. Let me know when they get within 100 yards, Watson instructed. "Yes, sir," Max acknowledged. Turning to Robert, Watson issued a command. "Grab those tools and get out to the fence. I'll be there in a minute." Robert nodded in understanding and swiftly obeyed, leaving Mr. Watson and Sophia alone in the barn. "I know what you're going to say, and the answer is no," Sophia stated firmly. Mr. Watson let out a sigh, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You remind me so much of your mother, loyal to a fault." Well, I'm just glad Mom trained you so well, Sophia quipped with a hint of amusement. You're not raising your voice and ordering me to go someplace safe. You're just smiling and accepting what's going to happen, she observed. Both of them shared a moment of laughter as they stepped towards each other and embraced. Mr. Watson held his daughter tightly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head before releasing her. He gave her a long, loving look before Sophia spoke softly. We're going to get through this, Dad. I know we are, sweetie. I know we are, Mr. Watson affirmed. The two of them stood there for another moment before the walkie-talkie crackled to life. They're a little more than 100 yards away, Max said. We're on the way, Mr. Watson replied promptly. You better get out there before Max runs away, Sophia teased. Mr. Watson cracked a smile as he turned and headed towards the barn exit, while Sophia returned to her work on the barrel. Both of them understood the grave situation they were in, but neither wanted to vocalize the daunting odds they faced. They were going to do what they had done throughout the entire apocalypse, fight with everything they had and figure out a way to survive. Chapter 3. Mr. Watson emerged from the shelter of the barn, rain pelting his face like icy needles as he tilted his head defiantly toward the heavens. A resounding crack of thunder split the darkness, followed by a jagged bolt of lightning that momentarily illuminated the landscape. Standing firm against the tempest, he seemed to challenge Mother Nature herself, his gaze unwavering, filled with a stubborn resolve. He turned from the storm and adjusted his attention towards the situation at hand. Mr. Watson began jogging toward the fence. Ignoring the aching in his old bones, he focused on his objective, opening the gate for his daughter, who would soon be driving through. Once the gate was open, he picked up the pace, pushing himself forward, knowing that he needed to get into position. Crossing the vast expanse of the field, each thunderous boom and dazzling flash of lightning guiding his way, he drew nearer to where Robert and Max stood. Faint moans carried on the wind, a haunting accompaniment to the relentless downpour. Thank God you're here, Max responded urgently. They're almost to the fence. Mr. Watson positioned himself at the edge of the field, his gaze fixed on the looming silhouette of the barbed wire fence just 10 yards away. Beyond it, the sprawling mass of the zombie horde extended 20 yards across the grass, disappearing into the darkness with an ominous uncertainty. Beneath their feet lay a scattered assortment of makeshift weapons, a desperate arsenal assembled for the impending struggle. Without hesitation, Mr. Watson reached for the sling blade, his action prompting Robert and Max to arm themselves in turn. Robert grasped an axe, while Max seized the hefty branch cutter. I want you boys to stay here, Mr. Watson instructed. When they start getting close to the barbed wire, I want you each on your own post. Make no mistake, they're going to get through this, but if we can thin their ranks a bit, we can buy time. Concern etched across his face, Robert interjected. Where are you going? I'm going to slow them down before they get to the fence, Mr. Watson declared. Robert and Max exchanged a worried glance, their apprehension evident, but they remained silent, recognizing that questioning Mr. Watson would only waste precious time they couldn't afford to lose. Meanwhile, Mr. Watson seized the post digger, his weathered hands wrapping around the handle as he strode purposefully toward the barbed wire fence. With a swift motion, he drove the digger into the earth until it stood erect. Then, with a practiced maneuver, he navigated through the rows of wire, slipping into the dark void beyond. Emerging on the other side, he gripped his sling blade tightly, his focus unwavering as he confronted the encroaching mob. Amidst the sea of decaying figures, two ghouls stood out, their eager moans barely audible over the roaring thunder. Mr. Watson advanced, the sling blade cutting through the air with a menacing arc. With a powerful swing, he aimed for the lower extremities, the blade connecting with rotting flesh with a sickening thud, the force reverberating through his arms and side. The sling blade sliced through the first creature's legs with surprising ease, the decaying limbs offering little resistance to the farm tool's sharp edge. With a powerful thrust, Mr. Watson drove the blade straight through the second leg of the ghoul, then continued the motion, cleaving through the leg of the next zombie before halting just shy of a complete severance. As the partially dismembered ghouls collapsed to the ground, they tripped up several others in their path, causing a momentary disruption in the horde's advance. Breathless but determined, Mr. Watson glanced back at Robert and Max, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "This is going to work," he affirmed. Mr. Watson redirected his focus to another ghoul that had strayed from the pack, delivering a forceful swing of the sling blade. In the face of just one opponent, the blade sliced through both legs effortlessly, sending the creature tumbling to the ground in a heap. As a bolt of lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the area before him, Mr. Watson saw the horde beginning to converge, their collective mass leaving no clear path for further individual strikes. Realizing the need to regroup, Mr. Watson reluctantly retreated back through the fence, satisfied with the effectiveness of the weapon in their defense. Once on the other side, he discarded the sling blade and seized the post digger, casting a glance to his right and left to find Robert and Max flanking him. With a nod of solidarity, all three men braced themselves for the imminent onslaught of the zombies, mere yards away from the barbed wire fence. As the first creatures reached the fence on Max's side, the urgency of the situation became palpable. Max found himself frozen in dread as he watched the barbed wire strain under the weight of the pressing undead, his concern mounting as it seemed the barrier might not hold. Mr. Watson's booming voice yelling at him shattered Max's fear-induced trance, jolting him into action. He stepped forward, brandishing the branch cutters as his weapon of choice. His eyes locked onto his first target, a gaunt female zombie weathered by countless trials. Without hesitation, Max wrapped the scissor-like blades around the ghoul's neck, his grip tightening as he summoned every ounce of strength. With a swift and decisive motion, he squeezed the handles with all his might. The sharp blades of the cutters made quick work of the undead flesh, cleanly severing the creature's head from its body in a single fluid motion. As the lifeless corpse crumpled to the ground, joining its detached head, the branch cutter dropped down atop the barbed wire, awaiting the next victim. Setting his sights on a larger adversary this time, he positioned the blades against its neck and applied pressure. Yet, despite his efforts, the creature's thick neck proved resistant, allowing only a partial cut. Frustration surged through Max, manifesting in a primal scream as he forcefully thrust the tool forward, determined to overcome the obstacle. With a final, desperate squeeze, he succeeded in severing the head, unleashing a satisfied yell of triumph. In the midst of his victory, a bolt of lightning struck in the distance, momentarily blinding Max with its brilliance, but also revealing the grim reality of the battlefield. The two zombies he had dispatched were but a drop in the ocean, their demise doing little to halt the relentless tide of undead. Glancing over at Mr. Watson and Robert, Max witnessed their valiant efforts to hold the line. Mr. Watson wielded his digging tool with lethal precision, dispatching zombies with precise strikes to their heads. However, despite his best efforts to push them back upon death, several bodies slumped forward, entangling themselves in the barbed wire. The collective weight of these fallen creatures threatened to weaken the top line of defense and send it crashing to the ground. Amidst the chaos of the battle, Robert swung his axe forcefully, aiming not for necks but for skulls, his powerful strikes aimed at crushing the undead adversaries before him. Each blow landed with a sickening thud, shattering skulls one by one. Yet, like Mr. Watson, he faced the challenge of the fallen bodies, their weight threatening to compromise the integrity of their defense. As Max resumed his task of severing heads, he was momentarily oblivious to the urgent shouts of Mr. Watson over the cacophony of rain and thunder. Despite the elder's warnings, Max persisted in his mission, focused solely on dispatching the zombies before him. It wasn't until he felt a firm hand on his shoulder that Max snapped out of his single-minded focus, his instincts primed for a potential threat. Whirling around, he found himself face to face with Mr. Watson. Though Max couldn't discern the words being yelled at him, he followed Mr. Watson's gaze and pieced together what he was saying. As the barbed wire barrier in the middle of their defense line gave way, allowing the undead to flood through, Max, Robert, and Mr. Watson had no choice but to retreat into the field, putting some distance between themselves and the encroaching horde. With a sense of urgency, they halted 20 yards away, bracing themselves for the next onslaught. "She's not out here yet. We have to buy her more time," Mr. Watson yelled. "What do we do?" Robert asked. "Whatever you have to do," he replied, offering no further guidance as he picked up his sling blade and marched resolutely toward the approaching mob. With a silent exchange of understanding, Robert and Max followed suit, joining Mr. Watson in facing the advancing horde. They watched as he swung the sling blade with all his might, managing to cleave through all four legs of the two creatures closest to him in a single, decisive motion. Meanwhile, Max surveyed the zombies on his side of the line, noting one that stood a few steps ahead of the rest. Contemplating his next move, he glanced down at his weapon and noticed a sharp tip on the blade. "This is such a bad idea," Max muttered under his breath. With adrenaline coursing through his veins, Max lunged forward, driving the sharp tip of his weapon into the chest of the approaching zombie instead of aiming for its head. As the blade pierced through undead flesh, he widened the blades to secure a firm grip on the creature, which responded with enraged thrashing. Undeterred, Max utilized the zombie as an improvised battering ram, forcefully shoving it from side to side in a desperate attempt to knock down some of the advancing undead. Despite the deep wound in its chest, the ghoul persisted in its pursuit, its drive putting Max in a perilous situation. With more zombies closing in and the fallen creatures beginning to rise again, Max realized he needed to act fast. Summoning every ounce of strength, he pushed the creature back with all his might, maintaining his grip on the weapon as he sought to create some much-needed distance between himself and the encroaching horde. The abrupt halt of the weapon's movement freed it from the ghoul's chest, sending the creature tumbling backward into the others, causing a domino effect that knocked several zombies to the ground. Max stole a momentary glance to the side, observing Mr. Watson and Robert engaged in their own desperate struggle against the relentless tide of undead. Despite their valiant efforts, the sheer numbers of zombies pouring through the breach in the fence threatened to overwhelm them. As despair threatened to consume him, Max's attention was abruptly drawn to a glint of light on the horizon. At first, he mistook it for another bolt of lightning, but then he realized it was the headlight of the four-wheeler. "Sophia's here." Max's voice reverberated through the storm, drawing the attention of Mr. Watson. With a final swing of his weapon, Mr. Watson took out the legs of another creature before signaling for a retreat. They dashed back to where Sophia waited, 20 yards behind them, her focus on unlatching the trailer from the back of the four-wheeler. "Is there a 2-minute fuse?" Mr. Watson inquired urgently. "Yeah, do you want me to light it?" Sophia responded. Mr. Watson glanced back at the approaching horde, his expression grim as he shook his head in refusal. "I want you three to get back to the barn," he instructed firmly. "There's going to be a lot of shrapnel, and I don't want anybody catching strays." Sophia nodded in understanding, dismounting from the four-wheeler and handing her father a lighter. "You light that thing and get back to the barn. You hear me?" she insisted. "I'll be there," Mr. Watson assured her with a nod. With a sense of urgency, the three youngsters dashed towards the safety of the barn, their destination 50 yards away. Meanwhile, Mr. Watson turned his attention back to the approaching mob, calculating the optimal moment to ignite the fuse. Finally, with a flick on the lighter, he brought flame to fuse, watching as it quickly caught fire. Jumping onto the four-wheeler, he revved the engine and sped off towards the barn, the roar of the motor drowning out the sounds of the encroaching horde. Reaching the safety of the barn, Mr. Watson joined the others at the edge, his eyes fixed on the oil drum as the fuse burned down, casting an eerie glow in the darkness. As the mob enveloped the trailer, shambling past it in their relentless advance, Mr. Watson issued a command. "Get back behind the wall." As the chorus of moans drew nearer, tension hung heavy in the air, and Mr. Watson's mind raced with uncertainty. Had he timed it properly? Would the explosion be enough to repel their advance? Then, with a deafening boom, a blinding fireball erupted, illuminating the darkness with a fierce intensity. The force of the blast sent screws and nails rattling against the sides of the barn, adding to the cacophony of chaos. For a moment, there was silence, save for the distant echoes of moans that persisted even after the explosion had settled. Apprehension gripped the foursome as they anxiously awaited the outcome, wondering just how effective their makeshift defense had been. However, Mr. Watson spoke up forcefully. "Come on. There's still work to be done." Chapter 4. As the driving rain relentlessly pounded the farm, Mr. Watson ushered Robert, Max, and Sophia out from the shelter of the barn to witness the aftermath of the detonation. Merely 50 yards away, separated by the barbed wire fence, lay a scene of utter carnage. Dozens of lifeless bodies littered the ground, some grotesquely missing limbs, while others bore the unmistakable stillness of death from a headshot. Flames engulfed many more, yet the torrential downpour worked swiftly to quell the inferno. Upon surveying the grim tableau, Mr. Watson couldn't suppress a sigh. Across the distance, a cluster of creatures, perhaps a couple dozen, began to stir amidst the devastation, their movements sluggish as they attempted to rise from the ground. "Hit them while they're down," Mr. Watson commanded. He seized his whole digging tool and bolted toward the fence, the others grabbing nearby implements, axes, and a branch cutter and hastily following his lead. With a swift yank, he flung the gate open, charging toward the closest zombie that had managed to claw its way to a precarious stance on all fours. Driving the tool into the back of its skull, he grimaced as he noticed numerous hardware projectiles protruding from its torso. No sooner had he dispatched the first than he lunged at another nearby target, plunging the tool into its temple and sending it crumpling to the ground. Mr. Watson pressed on, his relentless assault driving him from one staggering creature to the next, while the others joined the frenzied fray. Over the next few frantic minutes, they worked with swift brutality, severing heads and smashing skulls with efficiency. Yet their efforts proved futile as most of the remaining zombies began to rise once more, the horde ominously regrouping. "Get back behind the fence," Mr. Watson ordered. "And Sophia, get that drum ready to go." "I'm on it," Sophia responded, sprinting back toward the barn. As she disappeared from view, the three men retreated through the gate, securing it tightly. Max's voice broke the tense silence. "How much time does she need?" "She gets 5 minutes," Mr. Watson replied tersely. "After that, I want you boys to get into the house. Stay low and away from the windows until this is over." All three of them surged toward the swinging gate, unleashing their fury upon the oncoming horde. Max wielded his cutter, severing heads with practiced efficiency, while Robert and Mr. Watson swung their axe and digging tool relentlessly. In a matter of moments, they felled half a dozen zombies, shoving them back into the seething mass. A solid minute of frenzied combat ensued before signs of trouble began to emerge. Despite the chorus of moans and the relentless storm, the ominous sound of wood cracking echoed through the air. "Move them over to the barbed wire," Robert shouted. But before they could react, Mr. Watson's command halted their movements. "No, keep them all centered. I have an idea. Just be ready to move when it breaks open." Both younger men nodded in understanding as Mr. Watson retreated toward the barn. Max and Robert resumed their gruesome task, knowing they fought a losing battle against the relentless tide of undead. Another tense minute passed before the gate's integrity truly began to falter. "It's going to go. Get back," Robert warned. Max nodded, his heart pounding with adrenaline, as he and Robert darted back from the gate just before it gave way at the latch. With a groan, the gate swung open, offering a clear path for the remaining horde of zombies to pour through. Their attention snapped back as they watched Mr. Watson racing toward them on the four-wheeler. They quickly parted, creating a path for him to pass through. Mr. Watson skidded to a stop just past them, leaping off the four-wheeler in one swift motion. With practiced efficiency, he hit the throttle and locked it, the vehicle roaring to life. Its front wheels lifted slightly as it charged forward, plowing through the advancing wall of creatures with force. A bolt of lightning illuminated the scene, revealing the four-wheeler carving a path through the mob of creatures, knocking bodies down as it went. "Get over to the house," Mr. Watson commanded. Robert and Max didn't waste a moment arguing. They grabbed their weapons and sprinted toward the safety of the house. Meanwhile, Mr. Watson dashed to the barn, his steps purposeful as he reached for the shotgun just inside the entrance. Taking careful aim at the approaching horde, he held his fire, waiting for a clap of thunder to pass before shooting. As soon as it rumbled overhead, he unleashed 3 rapid rounds toward the group headed for the house. While not fatal, the impact of the slugs was enough to divert the attention of most of the creatures toward him. "Yeah, that's right. I'm over here," Mr. Watson taunted, his voice carrying over the storm. Another thunderous clap echoed, and he fired off 3 more rounds, swiftly reloading as he glanced back at Sophia, who was putting the finishing touches on her oil drum. "Get that thing lit and start closing off the other side of the barn," he ordered. Sophia swiftly secured the top of the oil drum before flicking her lighter and igniting the fuse. "It's lit," she called out. Mr. Watson flashed a quick thumbs up to his daughter, maintaining his focus on the approaching horde as he fired off a few more shots. With deliberate calmness, he loaded his final 3 shells into the shotgun. "I'm saving these for close encounters," he declared. To ensure he had their full attention, Mr. Watson continued to whistle and yell provocatively as he slowly backed into the barn, the front edge of the ghouls mere yards away. "Yeah, that's right. Come on in. There's plenty of room for everybody," he taunted, his words echoing off the interior walls as the moans of the undead filled the air. Gradually retreating, he kept a steady pace, his eyes flickering over to the lit fuel drum. "That's a big boy," he remarked before firing off one final shot to maintain the attention of the creatures at the rear. Finally reaching the back of the barn, with the closest zombie just 15 yards away and closing, he found Sophia already working on shutting the other side of the door. "Give me a hand with this, Dad," she called out urgently. Breaking from his position, Mr. Watson rushed to assist his daughter, their hands scrambling to close the door just as the zombies reached it. He held it in place as Sophia grabbed the sliding wooden lock. Come on," he urged. With a struggle, Sophia managed to get the sliding lock into motion, sliding it into place a moment later, effectively trapping the creatures inside. However, the weight of their collective mass pressed hard against the doors, causing them to strain outward. Instinctively, both Mr. Watson and Sophia pressed their bodies against the doors, adding their weight to hold them in place. It provided some reinforcement, but they knew it wouldn't last long against the pressure. "I don't suppose you started a timer on that bomb, did you?" Mr. Watson asked. "I can't say that I did. However," Sophia's voice trailed off as she strained to peer through a crack in the wood, finally catching sight of the bomb. "The fuse is almost to the drum. It can't be more than 60 seconds, she reported. "Okay, we're counting to 20 then running like hell," Mr. Watson decided quickly. "What if the doors break?" Sophia asked, her concern evident. "Then we'll figure it out. Now start counting," Mr. Watson instructed firmly. Sophia nodded, her heart racing as she began to count silently. When she reached 15, she started counting aloud. 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, she exclaimed. Both Mr. Watson and Sophia broke away from the doors simultaneously, their adrenaline-fueled sprint carrying them across the open space. Behind them, the doors strained against the pressure, threatening to burst open at any moment. Yet father and daughter paid no heed to the impending danger as they focused solely on reaching safety. They had covered only about 30 yards when they heard the wooden lock snap in half with a deafening crack, echoing like a clap of thunder. Glancing back, they witnessed the doors swing open, revealing the chaos and pending destruction within. Fortunately, the fuse had reached its conclusion. A massive fireball erupted from the barn, engulfing everything inside in a raging inferno. Unlike the creatures set ablaze outside in the field, the rain couldn't penetrate the shelter of the barn's roof. Within moments, the hay caught fire, fueling the blaze and intensifying the inferno. Sophia and Mr. Watson stood rooted in place, their eyes fixed on the unfolding carnage. Inside the barn, the zombies initially remained standing, their bodies consumed by the flames until they succumbed to the relentless heat, their flesh melting away from their bones in a grotesque spectacle of destruction. "That's going to be a hell of a mess to clean up." "We'll make Robert and Max do it," Mr. Watson replied matter-of-factly. "Don't you think they might get mad at that?" Sophia countered. "Why do you think I sent them up to the house? I can lay a hell of a guilt trip on them for staying safe and dry while we were taking down the barn," Mr. Watson explained with a smirk. Sophia laughed, playfully smacking her dad on the arm. Their moment of levity was interrupted by the crackle of the walkie-talkie. "Mr. Watson, are you and Sophia okay?" Robert's voice came through. "Hey, Robert, we're okay. How do things look on your end?" Mr. Watson replied. "Most of those things were in the barn when that thing went off. There were a few stragglers who started wandering back when it went off. I don't know if they're still standing or not, but they shouldn't be too hard to take out if they are," Robert reported. "Okay, you two sit tight. We're going to let this burn for a few more minutes before coming your way." Don't want to take any chances, Mr. Watson instructed. I'll get a pot of water boiling. You two are going to need something warm, Robert offered. Yes, we are. We'll be there soon, Mr. Watson acknowledged. As the walkie-talkie fell silent, Mr. Watson wrapped his arm around his daughter, pulling her close. I'm proud of you, girl. None of us would be standing here if it wasn't for you, he said sincerely. We're just lucky you married a woman who liked to blow stuff up, Sophia quipped. They shared a laugh as the rain began to taper off. Though it still fell steadily, the worst had passed. Mr. Watson couldn't help but hope that the same could be said for the undead menace as well. The end.